Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants. My name is Pierre Jacquet. I am the chairman of the president, of the Global Development Network, GDN, co-organizer with Campbell Collaboration of this conference. And it's my pleasure to coordinate this panel on funding for development. As you know, to generate evidence for development, we need resources. These resources can, of course, be granted nationally within developing countries. That's probably not the case enough, and most of the funding comes from development funders, and that links to this what we could call the development funding dilemma, where we have external funding for internal use in developing countries. And many aspects of this local, global dimension have been discussed in the various sessions so far, and they will be present, obviously, in our discussion. We are lucky enough to have a stellar panel with us. Let me briefly present the panel members by alphabetical order. Let me start with Tania Alfonso, who is a senior evaluation specialist at USAID. She has a strong experience on non-profit organization, NGOs, international relations, policy analysis, and research. And she will bring her expertise in this discussion. Thank you, Tania. Norma Altshuler, who is a program officer on gender equity and governance at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. She focuses on increasing the use of data and evidence to improve public policies in developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, this is very appropriate given the title of our sessions, Funding Evidence for Development. Next is Annabelle Burgett, who is Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Annabelle works on the development policy and finance team. She focuses on aid, policy, and debates surrounding notably the post-2015 development agenda, and she works on financing for development as well. And finally, Arjan Haan, who is a senior program specialist at the International Development Research Center, IDRC, in Canada. He works on sustainable inclusive economies. He has a lot of experience on research and practice of international development on public policy as well. So welcome to all of you. I would like to organize our discussions around three broad set of questions. The first set is going to be about impact. The second set is about to be on the current trends in funding evidence for development. And the final part of the discussion will be on the challenges that each of you see in this responsibility of funding evidence for development. So let me start with, and for each of these set of questions, we'll open the floor to take comments and questions from the floor. So please use the chat facility that you can find on the right of your screen to intervene in the discussion and ask questions. So let me start with the first set about impact, because obviously if founders found evidence for development, that's because they believe that this funding will have an impact, that evidence itself will have an impact. So there are a number of questions related to that. I mean, what kind of impact do we expect? What does it mean to use evidence, and how can we monitor this use and the impact it has? What kind of evidence generation, what kind of evidence work is more likely to produce that impact? Who should define it and measure it? Maybe impact as perceived by the founders is not the same as impact that would be prioritized within developing countries. So who chooses that? So a number of questions, and of course feel free to address one of these or any other questions related to impact that you would have. And let me give the floor to start the discussion to Annabelle.
Thanks very much, Pierre. And thanks everyone for joining us. I'm really happy to be here. And there are a lot of questions in there, so I will maybe start addressing some of them and then pass over and see if we can have a discussion. So I've been at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for about 8 years, funding evidence for much of that. Previously, I was a receiver of grant funding in this space, but my perspective on funding evidence is really shaped by my work at the foundation and the approach there. At the foundation, we are organized really by program or sector. So we don't have a team that's focused functionally on funding evidence. We're really driven by our programmatic work. But across, I think, almost all of our program teams, if not all of them, funding for data and evidence is really a huge part of our strategies. It's often the first kind of entry point for us in a new space. And I think that speaks to one of the outcomes or impacts that we seek is in funding data and evidence is informing our own strategy and our own programmatic investments. So we are certainly a user of the data and evidence that we fund, but we also view it as a public good for our development partners, for governments, for the broader field, and I think see sector alignment as another critical outcome and impact that we seek in funding data and evidence. I sit, as Pierre said, on the Development Policy and Finance team. I'm in the Global Policy and Advocacy Division at the Foundation. So most of the evidence that I fund it's really to serve our advocacy agenda. So I'm privileged to be able to have a portfolio approach where I fund not just data and evidence and kind of think tank organizations, but also advocacy groups that take that data and evidence and focus on dissemination and use and uptake. And really, I think of the kind of evidence to advocacy field as a spectrum of organizations which sit on different pieces as opposed to a binary. One example that we use a lot at the foundation is funding exemplars research. So exemplars, in particular, programmatic or policy areas, with the intention to kind of share best practices across different contexts and countries and think about scaling good solutions. But there again, I think we come back to the point where having the evidence is not enough, and you really need a kind of diverse set of partners to be able to take evidence and share it effectively so that it is used. I think one other thing that is really critical in thinking about that portfolio approach to funding evidence is the credibility and legitimacy of different institutions, particularly if you're trying to share evidence across different country contexts. So that's one thing that we try and approach with a portfolio of partners. I think in terms of maybe getting a little bit to the question of how we monitor and define impact, we certainly have a very strong internal strategy process at the foundation. But within that, each programmatic team does a lot of consultation with our partners, both government partners and also grantee partners in both setting that strategy as well as monitoring the impact and outcomes along the way. I think I'll pause there at the fear of going on for too long. Thanks very much. Pierre, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Thank you for your comment, and thank you for being brief. I think you made important points, especially about the use of evidence for the funders need in terms of strength of the strategy, quality of funding and impact and so on, which is also an important dimension of the use of evidence. Let me turn to Norma now.
Thanks, Pierre. Before answering your question, I'll say a brief word about Hewlett's goals to contextualize what we mean by impact. I think we're a good complement to funders like Gates and others who have really sector-specific needs and who use impact to inform needs, and that our goal is really supporting the cross-cutting field of evidence-informed policy. We recognize that most funding in evidence is for a particular policy or sectoral objective, and so our interest is really in building a field of durable, evidence use-oriented institutions that will achieve impact across multiple sectors. And I think another important complement to what Annabelle described is that we are really focused on informing the decisions of governments, and particularly governments in our East and West Africa geographic focuses, more than on informing the strategies of other parts of Hewlett that do, and with other grant-making portfolios. So turning to Pierre's question about what we mean by impact, we have three interconnected goals. One is that we want to support the use of evidence in policy decisions in ways with plausible potential to improve people's well-being. So what do I mean by plausible potential to improve people's well-being? Well, we certainly get excited when one of our grantee partners contributes to the use of evidence in, for example, a national initiative to cut malnutrition. But we also get even more excited when we see that there's signs that the malnutrition program is actually being rolled out in a high quality way that could improve people's lives, even if we don't have really rigorous evidence that is our work that what made the difference towards that. Our second goal is around promoting the ongoing use of evidence within government systems. So I think the traditional evidence-informed policy field approach, which the field has come a long way from, is I have a specific piece of evidence and I want it to inform policy. And that's important. But what we're trying to complement that with is how can we start from where governments are and support them in being more evidence-friendly and having the incentives, the capacities, the relationships to use evidence in an ongoing way. So for example, many more governments are starting to have national evaluation policies or departmental evaluation policies. And we're excited to support NGOs that are supporting not only do you have an evaluation policy, but also are you using that policy? Do you have the capacities and incentives within governments to have that be a meaningful way of informing decisions? And I'm happy to talk more if it's helpful about the role we've seen non-governmental organizations playing in that kind of processes. And our final goal in terms of impact is supporting the strong evidence-informed policy field that contributes to these two goals around changing governments and around improving policies and ultimately outcomes for people. So that means resilient resource organizations that are really focused on evidence use and that have the skills and capacities to evolve to even more effective approaches over time. Before passing back the mic, I'll just say a quick word about who defines and who measures impact. I think that's of course, it's a two-way street, but one thing we're particularly excited about is ways to support the field of organizations themselves in getting smarter about these questions about plausible potential for impact. So it's pretty hard if you're a think tank in Malawi, for example, to know some of what happened next in terms of was your research actually used. And we think an important part of building a stronger field that is going to learn over time is supporting organizations in developing capacity to get at least some data on the questions around use.
Thank you very much, Norma. Again, very important points on the whole system of evidence to policy and how to strengthen it. Let me give the floor now to Arjan.
Thanks very much, Pierre, and organizers Gideon and Campbell for this panel, inviting me, and congratulations on what I think is a fantastic, fabulous conference. So this might be a good time to make some definitive statements about whether randomized controlled trials are in fact the ideal way to generate useful knowledge in international development. I'm just kidding. And of course, I'm also just plagiarizing. I was just trying to watch Norma's reaction because this, of course, is a quote from an article by Ruth Levine in 2017. That article is called the moral case for evidence in policymaking. And I did want to highlight that at the start of my comments. What Ruth emphasizes, and I paraphrase, is that values about social justice and evidence and impartiality are linked in inseparable ways. Our discussions about methods, how we support evidence creation and ensure this is most likely to make an impact, all that need to be seen as a function of that overarching question that Ruth posed. And I think all four of us are speaking to exactly that question. A little bit about IDRC, Canada's International Development Research Center. It's a little bit of an outlier in the group of funder. As part of Canada's development program, we were set up as a semi-government organization with a specific mandate to support research and researchers in the global south. And like most all funders, I think here we fund research, innovation, and scaling to help solve development problems across many sectors. And now, having funded that development research for some 50 years, the lessons about what kind of approaches and kind of work makes a difference, as you might imagine, are very diverse. But I wanted to mention three things. At IDRC, we think a lot about who should carry out research. And I think Norma just spoke to this very well. And I think we're very much on the same line. Of course, it's IDRC's mandate to support Southern researchers. That local ownership is a value in itself, but we also know that it is necessary and can make a difference. A meta-evaluation of IDRC-supported research, some of that is published, and a new one is ongoing, which we hope to share in the near future, shows that scientific research quality and the use of research, first of all, are not necessarily competing objectives. Scientific research quality and the use of that are not necessarily competing objectives. And I'll come back to that later if there's time. And that local researchers are often placed to implement this. And I would like to add, so this is a meta-evaluation of, I think, of some 80 projects, and more is forthcoming. And I would like to add to this also the findings of the think tank program, and also which was supported by Hewlett and Gates, by the way, that relatively flexible funding has an important role to play for local researchers to carry out meaningful research in their context. So relatively flexible funding. And second, while funding for Southern research is insufficient, and I hope we have time to talk about this later, the capacity and incentives for research, including applied research in the global south, remains limited. Again, this is, of course, our core mandate at IDRC, but important to emphasize also that same evaluation is showing that there are no necessary trade-offs either between capacity building and scientific rigor. There's no necessary trade-off between capacity building and scientific rigor. So for me, the most important thing about this work is that we have a framework called ArcQ+, that provides a practical framework for evaluation, including of ongoing programs, as we did in our program on women's economic empowerment. And the key is to ensure that we judge 4 or 5 aspects key to all projects and all stages of project development and evaluation: scientific rigor, relevance and legitimacy, positioning for use, and capacity building. So in summary, in answer to, and I'm sorry if I went on too long, Pierre, projects that see each of those dimensions as equally important are the ones that we think are most likely to make a difference.
Thank you very much, Arjan. I think that some of the challenges that you mentioned will be taken up in the last part of our discussion, but let me just point out the point that you made on quality, on the insufficiency of funding, and maybe challenge you a little bit on what you said about the ArcQ+, which I think is a fantastic framework to measure evidence, but not necessarily the use of evidence. So that's something, the question that you may want to come back later on. But I think what it does is to renew the appreciation of quality, and I think that's one of the challenges that is in front of us when we want to promote evidence for development, how to combine quality, rigor, relevance, and use. Let me move to Tania now.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Pierre, for moderating, and thank you so much to Gideon for inviting me. I have attended a few other panels and plenaries, and it has been really interesting, and I might be repeating what others said, but it might be might bear repetition in some cases. Let me start with, there are many different definitions of evidence. You're in a room full of people and there are going to be 10 different definitions if there are 10 people. I'm going to focus specifically on evaluations because that is the office that I sit in right now. I'm in the Office of Evaluation at USAID. And we fund evaluations to a huge extent. We invested at least $192 million in fiscal year 20 on completed evaluations. And this has been a pattern for multiple years. We were the first federal agency to have an evaluation policy. And it was some of our policies and mandates were the base for the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act in 2018, which now applies to almost all United States federal agencies. And so at a 10,000 foot level, we fund evaluations to maximize development impact. The more we know about what we're doing and about what works, and the more we use that knowledge, the likelier it is that our programs will improve development outcomes. So we use evaluations to inform better decisions and inform course corrections. But let me take a step back and talk about sort of my background and my transition into the agency. So I have been at USAID for about 10 years. And prior to that, I worked for Innovations for Poverty Action. I was country director in Peru, and then I was a training and capacity building director for IPA. So prior to joining USAID, 99% of the sort of brain space and energy of the people that I was working with was devoted to designing, managing, conducting, and using the results from randomized controlled trials. So imagine the culture shock when I joined USAID from colleagues that 99% of their brain and their working energy was devoted to conducting randomized trials, to an agency for which that is not their main, that is not the main function of most of the people that we work with. We are lucky if we can use 10% of their brain, because everything else is devoted to policymaking, budgeting, human resources, politics within their missions, everything else. There's a sort of fire hose of mandates and requirements and things that people have to do. So within the agency, I was a huge culture shock when I realized that. But our office is now is devoted to how do we make use of that 10%. We can't increase people's sort of brain space and time because they're always going to have all these other things they have to be doing. So how do you increase the efficiency of the time that they do have to consider evidence and to use evidence and to make course corrections and everything else? So we fund evaluations through contracts. Most of the time you have an evaluation is being conducted of an activity that is being evaluated. So all of a sudden you already have many different relationships within that sort of evaluation product. You have the evaluation contractor, you have the activity, the people who manage the activity being evaluated. You have the NGO or the contractor that is conducting the activity. Then you have the people that manage the evaluation team. You have the people that manage the activity being evaluated. You have maybe the mission director. Maybe you have people from within a USAID country. You have the people that are at headquarters talking to them and telling them what to do, so on and so forth. So all of a sudden you have, even internally, 8 or 9 different people involved in this. So one realization that I realized was, how do we use this 10% effectively? The other is, every evaluation, for lack of a better term, needs a family therapist, right? You need someone to make sure, someone or an entity to make sure that all these different people are talking to one another. If this family therapist is a marriage counselor, then you need someone to recommend that you go on date nights with your spouse to make sure you talk to one another. Because on a day-to-day basis, you're involved in making sure the kids get to school, they do their homework, everything. You have all these different things going on. And how do you create this space where you take a step back and you consider, what do we need to do? What are we doing? What does the evidence say that should inform our decisions? So it's not for lack of desire and lack of requirements to use evidence in decision making. It's that there are 50 million other things going on at the same time. So the sort of joining USAID and realizing all of this required that I think about the structures that we need to set up to use evidence in development programming. So, and a recent report from the Center for Global Development had that exact phrase that I really liked. Part of improving USAID's evidence orientation involves thinking about making use of structures, staffing, and incentives to integrate the use and generation of evidence throughout the agency's work. So how do we set up this staffing, contracting, and processes to use evidence? I don't want to, so this is sort of my introduction, and I think that's what I hope to talk about throughout the next questions is structures, staffing, processes to make all this actually possible. So again, we have the mandate, we have the desire, we want to do it. There are 20 million other things happening at the same time. So how does this actually happen? Thank you.
Pierre, I think you're on mute.
Yes, well, I was muted actually. No, thank you very much. That was fascinating. One of my observations, though, is that when we talk about the use of evidence, one tends to focus on the ways to promote the use of evidence. And that's, of course, necessary. But I'm still waiting for a proper definition of what we call use of evidence. There is a lot of potential misunderstanding about this. For example, many people think that using evidence amounts to following recommendations stemming from evidence. So you have recommendations made in research papers, and you will measure the effectiveness of the piece of research by whether a government was willing to actually follow a recommendation. And I think that none of us probably think that using evidence means that, but then it means taking evidence into account in the decision-making process. But this cannot really be measured because in the end, the decision may go contrary to the evidence simply because there are many other pieces of evidence that will be taken into account in making the decision. So that's one of the difficulties, I think, around this whole notion of use of evidence that can lead to making mistakes or to measuring in the wrong way or to forgetting that evidence needs to be part of a democratic debate and is not the key to a deterministic future in which we know what should be done because there is evidence. So these are the questions that I think still take a lot of potential misunderstanding in the various debates about evidence. So anything you will want to say about use of evidence will be welcome. But let's use that to move to the second stage, which is, okay, you have told us how you saw the reason to fund evidence, really the impact that is sought, why it was being done. What trends do you see in this job? And what I mean by trends is really two things: is the constraints that you face, new and old, to produce evidence. Do you feel that you are free to define what it means, and or you need to actually produce a given number of indicators that may not correspond to what you think as useful evidence? And the second dimension of trends is what's actually happening through collective action in the world. I have the feeling, for example, that what some of you mentioned, which is to promote evidence produced locally, is an idea that is becoming stronger and stronger. And of course, from GDN's perspective, we welcome that, because this is exactly at the core of the mission of GDN. But there may be, Arjan mentioned that funding is insufficient. Do you see a trend in funding for locally produced evidence and so on? So let me give you the floor on that and ask you to be very brief, because I think we need to keep some time to discuss the challenges that all of this represents. So let me start with Norma.
Thanks, Pierre. So I think it's important to take a moment to celebrate how far the evidence field has come, by which I mean the practitioners actually doing the work, because I think that the signs of progress we're seeing in certain early trends from funders are based on what practitioners are doing. So, you've seen a much greater emphasis on usage in this conversation than in similar conversations we might have had 5 or 10 years ago, and there was so much work to be done on the early work of production and figuring out some paths to use. And I think that one of the exciting things I see there is that a greater portion of researchers and practitioners are really seeing government as the client. And to Tania's point about 10% of brain space, I think we've seen that when an institution is really trying to say, all right, you're trying to figure out how to respond to COVID and to balance lockdowns versus economic gains, when organizations are helping governments solve the problems, you can expand from maybe 10% to 20% or 30% of someone's energies, as well as really make the most use of that, of whatever energies that are available. So I think that we're increasingly seeing the importance of long-term partnerships between researchers and practitioners and of embedded work, and that funders are not as fast as we would like, but slowly starting to realize and in some cases resource those sorts of longer-term arrangements. Second, I'll say briefly that, as I know Arjan will continue to talk about, the research leadership from people who are closer to the problem, be that national researchers or researchers from other countries who have long-term relationships, is something that I think funders are increasingly getting behind the importance of. I think there's more work to do for funders to meet the field where it is, but the attention to this is really something important that I think practitioners have an opportunity to build on. Happy to talk more about how later. And finally, and I think this gets to Pierre's point, I think we've seen progress towards the need for the best available evidence to inform a decision on its timeline. So for example, during COVID, lots of the impact evaluation organizations that had done great long-term research on cash transfers had increased willingness to say, look, we don't have perfect evidence, but here's what I think we should do in this circumstance with the best available information on this timeline. We have to make some decisions faster than we can generate new evidence, as well as we're seeing new tools like geospatial evaluations that have faster, cheaper evidence. So I think just quickly getting to Pierre's point about evidence use and what that means, to me, it's that some portion of the time we see a better outcome that evidence appears to have contributed to. So in the cash transfer example, wasn't as simple as following the recommendations about a report during a non-crisis time about what to do with stable cash transfer programs. But in several countries, we saw things like expanding cash transfer programs to informal workers or other instances where some, but not all decisions were informed by the evidence, and that played a role in a better outcome for people.
Thank you very much, Norma. Tania?
Thank you. So let me think first about how do we know that we're using evidence. My recommendation, especially for the US government, is to follow the money. Like, what is being funded, and have those funding streams changed as a result of evidence coming out about what works in whatever sector it is, right? In education or in health or in things like that. So one, follow the money. And two, look at whether there are mid-course corrections in agreements, in grants or contracts that have already been funded. So if there is evidence either from a midterm evaluation or from monitoring data that is telling us that this is not working and we should do something else, can we make that shift? But in order to do that, then we have to have contracting agreements that allow us to make those changes, right? If you have a contract that says you must do these things over the next 5 years, then if evidence is showing something else, then you can't make that correction. So in order for us to be able to use the evidence, so it's not so much whether we're absorbing the evidence, but rather in order to use it, there are some sort of organizational and management changes that dictate how that happens. So, we have changes to our sort of operations policy that, mandate planning for evidence use. So you schedule a mid-course stock taking halfway through, or you have more flexible contracting, more flexible agreement language to make it easier to make a change. And even so, that's for using it. And then for making evidence usable, some of our contracting is now, for example, if you're commissioning an evaluation, sure, you need that 30-page report that that the evaluator turns in. But it might be useful to have other deliverables, like a 2-pager or some sort of presentation or some sort of different funded engagement with whoever you're expecting should use the results of your evidence. So all these things I'm talking about are not so much the generation of evidence, but rather these other sort of supplementary products that are necessary. So changes in contracting, both for adaptability of the contract, but changes in contract also to create whatever product is more useful than sort of a 30-page document. Something that I'm very excited about that has happened in the last maybe 5 years is USAID creating sort of longer term agreements with evaluators in country. So instead of having sort of, a contractor come from the US and fly in for 2 weeks and interview people and then deliver an evaluation report, blah, blah, you have a longer term, maybe 5-year agreement with a group of entities in country. And then you develop longer term relationships. You can call somebody who conducted your evaluation 2 years ago and ask, wait, what did this mean? And what was this? Just because it's the end of the evaluation task order doesn't mean that it's the end of the relationship. It also means that someone from the Ministry of X can call the person that they know whom they went to high school with and say, wait, what is the latest and greatest evidence around education, whatever else. So it's much more shifting the focus of our evaluation contracting from sort of US-based entities to sort of creating local relationships that will be in place for much longer term. I can talk forever, but the sort of main takeaway that I think I want people to remember is that, like, this is not rocket science. It's not like, but if it's not systematic, resource, and intentional, then it doesn't happen. Like, it has to be in an agreement or in a contract or in a plan. You don't just sort of depend that it's, take it for granted that it's going to happen. Over.
Thank you, Tania. Thank you very much. Arjan, your turn. Yes. Arjan, you are on.
Thanks. There's a lot of disturbance on my line. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, it's gonna. Thanks. Yes. So my thanks for that question. My take on that is come again from quite a rather different point than Tania's. First of all, to say I celebrate the progress in this with Norma. There's so much work on this. I think that there is really a lot of progress, and I think we're learning even more from kind of a more intense vantage point almost during the pandemic, of course. So perhaps this is a good time to elaborate a little bit on what I said earlier about the framework that we use, which we call RQ+, and this is important for various reasons. For us, it's a powerful framework for learning and preparation of projects and support, but also because it helps to, and I think you referred to that, Pierre, it also to help to describe the results, which our agencies and in the end, in our case, Canadian taxpayers quite rightly emphasize. So the RQ+ framework, I think, is really helping us beyond kind of a dichotomy opposition between scientific quality and use of research. And that's not to deny that there are no trade-offs. Of course, there's trade-offs, but it makes this kind of in a mandate and commitment, again, go back to roots, kind of why are we doing this, central to our planning and learning. So the first dimension in that, of course, is scientific rigor with peer review and public publication, of course, key to our thing. Not perfect, but you know, we do as well as we can. Actually, if I may, as a side note, just want to mention the excellent work that Andy McKay presented in one of the GDN panels, where he has been analyzing how in the process of publication and reviews in the review of development economics, what kind of barriers exist. And then if we want to think about things moving forward, I think we should definitely learn from that and build on that, Pierre. So the first element of that framework, of course, is scientific quality, rigor, and how that is measured. Secondly, the RQ+ framework makes importance and legitimacy, including ethics, including gender approach, as part of our thinking. How is it grounded in specific context, and what gaps does it fill in that sector or context? So it's moving slightly away from simple scientific rigor. Is not simple. I'm not saying that, but straightforward scientific rigor. Third one, the research uptake or use of research can be made a central part of project planning and evaluation. So this is the third or fourth dimension of that framework, and I think we typically assign equal weights to this, and one can argue about weights, of course. So in our program on women's economic empowerment, and I'd be very happy to share the reference, of course, was how this was done in a midterm evaluation was a research on small-scale mining in Central Africa, and the success of that project, by that measure, was driven by the combination of a strong multidisciplinary research team in close collaboration with both international and national and local organizations, with a track record in advocating for change. In that particular case, enhancing working conditions in the context of global supply chains and precious metals. Now, how do we know this? There's not enough time to elaborate on this, but it is possible for reviewers to go and see what the impact has been, what narratives that exist. We can never prove things. Political circumstances may change, but we can find a narrative. We did find in that evaluation evidence on how those research projects were positioned to impact that change. And the last thing I want to say is that the framework, RQ+ framework, makes research capacity also the fourth or fifth integral element of our framework. And both our observational experience and that meta-evaluation I referred to earlier are showing that these two do not need to have trade-offs. And again, and there's no time to elaborate on this, but that same project on very difficult research in a very fragile context showed that in that project, collaboration with all those partners, learning with partners, capacity building where needed, actually enhanced the quality of the research project. The last thing I want to say on that, this was not simple capacity building, it was actually about mutual learning, and where the researchers from strong northern institutions actually acknowledged in that evaluation. We learned as much from the working with our colleagues, advocates, and researchers in the south as the other way around. So again, it is possible to measure this. It's important. It's not 100% tight science, if you like. There's the judgment in that, but I think that framework is important to further develop and establish.
Thank you very much, Arjan. Let me now turn to Annabelle.
Thanks. I'll try and be very brief. So in terms of trends, I want to talk about two in use of data and two in funding. So would definitely agree with Norma that I think there's a much greater focus on use, and that is to be celebrated. I think one thing that's important to come to on defining use is it's not the matter of going away and producing a 30-page paper and then coming back and looking at who reads it. I would say two things there. One is thinking about who you're involving in the research along the way. And there are a lot of different ways of doing that. There's experimenting within government, within the kind of target of your evidence for use. There's also commissions, or just the relationships that fellows and researchers and think tanks or research institutions are building with policymakers. So I think that those relationships along the way and through the process of research are really important. And in terms of the outputs, would absolutely also agree. We need to think about different types of outputs, but often it's not kind of translating a single paper that has the solution into a 2-page memo. It's really kind of triangulating across a few different sources of evidence of variable quality, and we're trying to find proxies for what we're getting at. And you need to kind of synthesize across various different types and sources of evidence in order to feed and inform a policy conversation or decision. Second thing, just on funding of evidence and a couple of trends. I mean, so we, as I think was referenced, the foundation did participate in the think tank initiative, which was extremely flexible, long-term support for capacity funding. And as I said in my first intervention, I don't see a lot of that happening, certainly at the foundation, but even in the broader field at that kind of scale across many donors. But I do think there is scope to bring in some elements and learnings from the think tank initiative into the work that we do, which is kind of more sector or programmatic driven. So, for example, in investments we make in data and evidence, having a piece that is project defined alongside core support, or having a kind of longer term, more flexible investment in an institution, but within a sector or a defined body of work, which isn't quite as specified as a project financing, but not quite as open as TTI was. I do think there we still come up with tensions around, the time frame and how long we know policy change and capacity building takes, and always working to try and get longer grants. The last thing that I'll say is I think it's very important to continue to focus on reducing duplication. So while the foundation certainly wants to use evidence to inform our own programmatic strategy, what I think we are pushing for is investing in evidence and data in a country context that's produced locally and will have local use and relevance, and how we can take that and also use that to inform our own strategy, rather than just investing in something which is going to feed our needs first and foremost. And if we take that latter approach, often those investments do not lead to evidence and data that is as useful for our partners. I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much indeed. A lot has been said. We are late, but it is not unexpected. What I propose is that we take the challenges not as a separate part, which each of you speaking, but as a part which is directed by the debate and the question that we received. So let me introduce this and ask you to react. There are 4 aspects that came up either in the discussion or in the questions. One is about quality, and Arjan said there is no irreducible conflict between scientific quality and use of research, which I would call relevance of research. But in fact, he didn't define scientific quality. And I think one of the problems today is that scientific quality is not defined by rigor. It is defined by the possibility to publish in the best reviews, which in economics is distorted by technological innovation, innovative models. And this is not really useful from the developing country perspective. So there, I think there is a conflict which is due to the definition of quality. If we redefine quality by focusing on rigor, which is different, you can fill an Excel file with rigor that won't be published in the best journals, but can still be very useful. So if we are able to redefine quality, then the dilemma goes away. And we can have rigorous and relevant work. And actually, we just had a very nice program with the EIB, GDN, a 3-year program that evaluated impact investment in developing countries. And we selected young African researchers to do that. And they had to provide timely evidence. And they were mentored by very reputable scientists who help them define their research questions and their research work, and the product is very satisfactory. And it's a combination of relevance and rigor. It is not the rigor that will publish them in the best review, but they will be published in refereed reviews. So that can work. So in that sense, Arjan is right, but I think the challenge is still there, which is that when funders fund research, they have to respect some quality standards that may not be appropriate. So it's also a question for you on how you see this question of quality. The second set of questions that came is about funding. There was a question by Mr. Kwaku Apiakubi in the chat about whether there is funding for evidence-based health research systems in Africa. And if there is such funding, how to access it? So that's a question that you may want to take. But more generally, is there funding to fund research systems in developing countries? And that's something that we all hope it's coming, but it's still there. The third series of questions that came, and there was a question to Tania, basically, but all of you can contribute. Which is the sort of dilemma between, if there is a dilemma, or the relationship between internal accountability. Tania, in what you said, there is the impression that most of the evaluation work is directed toward improving the functioning of the institution itself, which is fantastic, by the way, because it means that you focus on the learning dimension of evaluation, and that's rare and difficult, so that's nice. But at the same time, there is another dimension of accountability, which is a kind of accountability that was in the Paris Declaration about aid effectiveness, which is external accountability to the developing countries themselves. Is what is found that help developing countries, and that's something that could be very, very useful. And finally, there is a whole series of questions about use, which is not in the chat but came up in this discussion and many others in this conference, which is linked to the political economy of using evidence. How do you see the ownership of evidence in developing country? When evidence is produced outside the country, it's a bit more difficult. And indeed, as some of you said, producing evidence is very often, if we want it to be effective, it has to be a partnership between various actors and not only researchers. And that's something that requires time and resources. So let me stop there and ask you to react to that. And I guess that might be your final reaction. So feel free to tell us what you think is most important, address some of these challenges, respond to these questions that you can find on the chat and that I summarized very, very briefly. So why don't we start with Tania, because she was a recipient of various questions, especially on this link between funding evidence to improve the institutions, the funding, the funders' quality, in fact, or funding evidence to improve development policy in developing countries. How do you see that?
Thank you, Pierre. I think it is challenging within USAID because the way that we operate is through spending money in different countries. And that money can be spent either through contracts or grants. And so, but we take a step back and USAID develops country strategies every 5 years that dictates this is what we're going to focus on. Those country strategies are not developed independently of the countries where we're working. There's a lot of stakeholder consultations and conversations, and deep interactions with the governments and national and subnational governments of the people with whom we are working. So in that sense, we are accountable to them. That is not, we don't just say, oh, we're going to spend money on X, and then whatever your opinions are don't matter. Like, there is this sort of deep introspection and conversations with the countries where USAID works about what would work, and with the ultimate goal of having any investments and anything that we do be sustainable. And with the view that most of the time, whoever is going to sort of take over after USAID ends a particular program is either the national government, the subnational government, or maybe entities in the private sector. So because of that, there is no sort of internal accountability to our programs without there being accountability to how this would work externally after we're gone or after we sort of graduate. So in that sense, I don't see that tension at a kind of macro level, but I also acknowledge that there are, very sort of shorter term interests and shorter term incentives for the individuals that are working at USAID. You're here, you're a foreign service officer, you're here for 4 years, you want to get this thing done, and then you're going to leave and move to a different country. So I do think that a lot of evidence use is about the evidence, but it's also about the sort of organizational development. What are the structures that we're having so that these, the evidence that we're generating stays within the country, and that knowledge and those structures are kept irrespective of who the individuals are that are involved in them. I could talk much longer, but I want to I'm curious to hear what other people are thinking about this.
Thank you, Tania. Arjan?
Thanks, Tania. Thanks, Pierre. That's a hard one to choose between the four. So I'm going to pick on there's much to say on each of those, and much more to discuss, showing the relevance of your panel here. I'm going to comment on the funding, and I know in that I am in a way talking to the converter, but maybe we can think about what we can do as a group. There are clearly not enough opportunities for researchers in the global south. That may not just be funding, right? The PEP session on day one brought this out very clearly, and once again, importantly, data is starting to show that this has not been improving over time, and that's really hard because Pierre, many of us, we've been working on this for 20 years. I think it's important to look at the data and see if a difference is being made. And I'm seeing observations that the access of researchers in the global south to any form of global research during the pandemic also is not improving. There is no data on this, be very clear, but I certainly see some observation, people starting to raise that. And like I said, I know I'm speaking to the converted, yet I do want to make a plea and perhaps work jointly on further developing the work that more clearly describes the access of Southern researchers to global research. And like I said, it's not just a funding issue, but the various reasons why if this is true and what we can do to improve it. I'm going to mention one more thing. I know I've spoken way too much, Pierre. You didn't mention that, but in the questions you had asked earlier, one of the challenges I think we absolutely need to talk about is around how the current global pandemic is being prolonged because of the inequity, inequality in access to vaccines. And I think we jointly have a responsibility to, for example, in research that's help understand, and I don't want to simplify this debate by any means, help understand how the access to the production, distribution, and use of vaccines, and in the end, the access to public goods and innovation can be prolonged, and the kind of global governance issues that are hindering or promoting this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Arjan. Annabelle?
Thank you. I'll be very, very brief. There's 1 minute. I mean, I would just to pick up on the accountability question, I absolutely think our focus at the foundation and more broadly is shifting to the accountability mechanisms at the country level between citizens and government, and that's where it ought to be. Certainly in the tracking of kind of development outcomes and impact and the funding of evidence there. I think we've been perhaps one step ahead in thinking about civil society and advocacy there, and we now need to catch up on the evidence and research institution side. But I think that is critically important for the long term. And would also just agree with Arjan that more coordination across funders would certainly benefit in thinking about these questions of supporting local institutions. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Norma?
Thank you. I'll pick up on the theme of what we can do about the challenges and how we can partially overcome some of them. You know, if for some problems at least, there's the first best solutions would be long-term support to Global South institutions and pots of money that are truly responsive to decision makers' needs and priorities. And so I think it's quite easy for both people within funding institutions who have constraints towards that or other important goals to feel powerless, as well as, of course, people on the other side of the funding table. And I think both Annabelle and Tania touched on some of the sort of second best solutions that creative people within funding institutions and also people on the other side of the table can promote and advance. So for example, Annabelle talked about work that she's done to couple project-specific grants with some flexible support. And I've also seen others of her colleagues at Gates or other big foundations do things like build in more long-term policy work on longer time horizons, build in time to prepare the research agenda in response to a policy question, build it not just come with a perfect question in the proposal, build in, and importantly, build in partnerships with Southern researchers, even if their institutions has trouble funding Southern think tanks directly. And similarly, Tania talked about creative work at USAID to support longer on-term ongoing relationships, even in the contract of possible specific project grants for project contracts. So I'll just say briefly in closing that I think that people who are on the implementer side really can make a difference in this by working with people in funding organizations to just try to say creatively, here's what we can achieve under this structure, and here's what we could achieve with a little more flexibility and trying to understand what is possible in the context of institutional constraints towards the goals that people often share.
Thank you very much. I think that you illustrated through your various comments the considerable responsibility on the funding side to actually direct evidence toward better impact, better results, not only in our institutions, but in the relation between evidence and policy making in developing countries. I mean, as a conclusion, let me just go back, and that was one of the questions asked us by Ramona on the chat, to this idea of family therapist, which I think is a very nice comparison. And then the question is, who funds the family therapist? The family therapist cannot intervene freely. It has a cost. It requires a lot of resources and energy. And on the the parallel with the family therapist is the knowledge broker that plays a big role in connecting funding with actually local ownership. And that is something, and the question is, who funds the knowledge broker? And our experience at GDN, it has become increasingly difficult to make a case for the broker, which is seen as a cost-producing intermediary. Instead as a service provider that of course has cost, but provides services that actually bridge the gap between the requirements of funding and the needs of developing countries. So this is, we'll of course leave that open. We don't have time to pursue the discussion, but this is something that it would be very nice to further take on in the discussions about the role of funding, the role of brokers and the family therapists, because it's exactly the same idea. and the impact of evidence funding. And finally, I will just end with an open question as well, which is the fact that we lack evidence on the impact of evidence. I think we need to work on that, because funding evidence distract resources that could be used elsewhere. I think we share around this panel the fact that it would be nice to have more funding for evidence toward development impact, but to build the case, it would be very useful to document how the use of evidence improves development impact in developing countries. It's not always easy to do. We can cite examples and cases, but it's very hard to define a counterfactual and build a discussion on that. That is something that probably is increasingly important, especially because there are competing sources of evidence. We talked implicitly here about scientific evidence, sound evidence, but as you know, there are around a lot of beliefs that are not founded, but may be used as evidence in the public debates, and that's something that can be dangerous and certainly not in the line with what we discussed about using evidence for policy. So let me close here and thank you very warmly for your contribution. That was a great discussion, very complimentary. I want to thank you very much for taking part in this panel, and thank the audience for their participation as well. Thank you, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice day. I don't know whether I don't know how to. I think someone is going to cut us off. Yes. Okay.
We'll just leave. Thanks, Pierre.
Thanks you all. Bye.